Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Welcome back, listeners. We're grateful to have you today. On today's podcast, we're going to circle back to the topic of nuclear energy, which we've spent a lot of time talking about on this podcast because there is so much going on in Wyoming right now. Today, we're really honored to have Todd Allen. He's the chair of the Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences at the University of Michigan. So welcome, Professor Allen. Welcome to the podcast. Let's start with your background.
Yep. So grew up in Michigan, sort of Midwest kid. Went to Northwestern as an undergrad, got a degree in nuclear engineering. Got there because the Navy gave me a scholarship. So I got into nuclear sort of because the Navy gave me a scholarship to go to college. And then I learned I had to do something, and I decided to be a submariner. Then I learned that submarines are run on nuclear power. So there you go. You
learned that when you were on the submarine or before?
Before. Yeah. No, it's even funnier. I had applied to be a computer science major. Mm-hmm. And then the Navy sent us to like a mini boot camp before freshman year. And then I learned I was going to have to pick, be a Marine, be a submarine, or submarine sounds interesting. And I'm talking to my freshman advisor, and I tell him the story, and he says, well, why don't you sign up for nuclear engineering instead? You can always switch later. And so I switched. It turns out he was a nuclear engineering prof, so he kind of reeled me in when he had the chance. Yeah. Anyway, so it's typical like high school kids serendipity stuff. But did that, spent 7 years in the Navy active duty, submarine officer. So that's where I sort of learned how to run a reactor. Then I left active duty, spent another 17 years in the Navy, so I'm a retired Navy captain. And then on the civilian side, I went and got my PhD in nuclear engineering in Michigan, sort of specializing in material science of nuclear systems. Worked in the national labs. I worked at Argonne National Laboratory, the Idaho facility. Then I got a faculty position at the University of Wisconsin. Then I went back to Idaho as the deputy lab director for science and technology, so sort of the number 2 person at the lab. It's really broadened my vision of our S&T, in the world broadly. Spent some time at a think tank in D.C., and back to Wisconsin for a little bit, and then I got recruited to my current job.
Wow, it's pretty varied. And so your second stint in Idaho was it Idaho National Lab at that point?
At that point, It had become Idaho National Lab.
Yep. Great.
And Argonne's West facility, right, was no longer Argonne's. It had become part of INL at that point.
Okay. And they've been, I should say, incredible partners to us at the School of Energy Resources and actually more broadly across the state as we've looked to build up even more in the nuclear energy sector than we've ever done before here in Wyoming.
Yeah, and I still work a lot with the lab. So they invited me to come to a town hall in Jackson and another one in Gillette. So got to engage with the state a little bit.
Great. Yeah, I remember that. I'm going to bring up something you said at that town hall later. It was something really funny that struck me, but we're not there yet. So I think we talk a lot about nuclear energy and kind of the conversation around energy at the state level, at the federal level, at the international level. One thing that doesn't always get covered is really the success of the naval fleet, the nuclear naval fleet. So we talk about microreactors, but we've had those actually for a long time. So obviously you said a professor that kind of reeled you in to get nuclear, and then your time in the Navy really led you start down this road on nuclear energy. What other lessons did you take away from your time working in the Navy and being on submarines?
Yeah, so I think the Navy program sort of makes you think about sort of success in running a reactor and paying attention to the details. Like you have to know. I mean, if you think about it, it's 100 people and you're running this very complex machine and you can't call for help, right? There is no fire department. You are the fire department.
Yeah. And you can't run away, right? If you get worried.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And so you really need to understand how technical systems work, how they might behave if something's going wrong, like how to interpret that, because you're in charge of the whole program. And so I think that was one lesson learned, right? So I think it's helped me be a very detail-oriented engineer. And that's whether I'm creating programs or instructors or just doing engineering, right? So I think that's was a very useful lesson. I think the Navy is very successful, but they're very quiet about the program, right? I think it's sort of purposely.
Yeah.
But I also think, when we talk about microreactors and things, I think many people don't know that large parts of the Navy rely on nuclear power and just how common that is. And I think in some ways that division between the military programs and the civilian programs have hurt the civilian programs, because the civilian programs also tend to want to keep your head down and be very quiet. But when you want somebody to appreciate your technology, but they've never seen it or visited it, it gets very hard, right? So I tell people, why am I comfortable with nuclear? It's because it was my home, right? I lived on this little floating city that was powered by nuclear. And then to your comment about microreactors, really that's what it is, right? Mm-hmm. You think about a submarine, the reactor is your propulsion, but it's all your heat, your power, your lights, your water, your fresh air, right? And if you think about, could you run a small city out of microreactor? Well, of course you could.
We've already done it. Yeah. Under the ocean.
Yeah.
No less, or deep in the ocean, I should say.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great perspective. And you've mentioned your time at National Labs. So it was Argonne West and then Idaho National Lab.
Yep.
First of all, broadly, how's the national lab system important to, from your perspective, to the nation's energy sector and then specifically to nuclear energy?
Yeah, so if folks don't know what the national labs are, there's 17 different, very large, these are run by the Department of Energy, or run by contractors for the Department of Energy. And they typically have deep scientific expertise, but they also tend to hold unique scientific facilities, things that the U.S. can't afford to have 20 of, right? And these are things like giant X-ray sources or giant neutron sources or test reactors. So they hold all that capability. And so from an R&D standpoint, I think it makes the U.S. special because they exist. Right? From the academic standpoint, they can be very useful in allowing our students to do work that builds on a base of what we can do at the university, and then maybe we send them to a lab to do a little incremental work on facilities we might not have. So that's what they do in general. They were all started for a very specific purpose, but over time they've drifted to be very broad-based. It's one of the struggles with the National Lab because they all think they're perfect at everything, right? And so from a programmatic standpoint and trying to decide where to spend money, it can sometimes look like the most important national lab is the one who has the congressperson on the appropriations committee.
That is important.
It is, yeah. But I think one thing that happened in nuclear about a decade ago that I think is really important to the current story of nuclear. For years, most of my early career, the U.S. treated nuclear like an R&D project, right? We spent money at universities and the labs, I think with the hopes that something would spin out and become a business. You've probably met researchers. Being good business people is not our thing, right? So we tend to drive for perfect knowledge rather than a good enough product, right? And so if you look at the history of nuclear, we never really did spin out a new product, right? So about 10 years ago, around 2015, 2016, it suddenly became clear that there were lots of privately funded, call it entrepreneurial nuclear companies starting up. I mean, Bill Gates is the most famous, clearly here in Wyoming, because he wants to build a project. But there were lots of them. And we got the Department of Energy and the White House to start an initiative called GAIN, which stood for Gateway for Accelerated Innovation in Nuclear. But at its core, it was, hey, National Labs, you hold all this great capability for testing materials and things, make it available to all these companies. And to a certain extent, I view that point as significant because Congress now sees nuclear as more real. Right? It's companies, right? It's not just a research project. And so I think that the National Labs becoming a common resource for a lot of companies is important to this story too.
Yeah. They offer a lot. They offer, they can work with us in academia or with the industry in a lot of different ways. It can be on small pieces, like looking at some small part of a fuel part, or it can even be testing a full cycle. Now, once you get to a certain scale of testing, you really do need to, when you're at the demonstration scale, you really do need to be off-site so that you can have the demand there, and that's what we're seeing. And when you said Bill Gates, I think most of our listeners would know, but just to confirm, you're referring to TerraPower, which is backed by Bill Gates, and they have the Natrium facility in Kemmer, Wyoming. It is an advanced reactor, so super exciting. So in your current role, nuclear engineering and radiological sciences and professor at the University of Michigan, you've taken a unique approach. So that's a very technical sounding department name. But you really have taken to heart and really emphasized the importance of social sciences in all the work that you do and that the group does. And you've walked the walk by hiring social scientists into that department. Can you talk about how did you decide, or when did you decide that that was really important to do?
Yeah, so I think it really coalesced around the time I was at Idaho National Labs, the second time. Right. So my job is to look at the R&D portfolio across the entire laboratory. But this is when it was becoming really clear to me that the nuclear engineering field had sort of evolved, maybe devolved, to a point where they thought about everything as a technical solution, right? That you would come up with a technology that was sort of so impressive or so beautiful that everyone would just want it, right? like it's the iPhone,
yeah,
right? But that rarely happens, right? And the challenges are not only technical, right? It's a combination of, technology, what does it do? But it's also the economics, what does it cost? It's the social acceptance, right? Do you get some pushback that limits your ability to deploy the technology? And then there's policy drivers where you can sort of move how much of a technology you deploy by either creating an advantage or a disadvantage, right? In a tax break or a tax. So it's sort of becoming more obvious to me. And I mentioned this creation of gain, right? So what started that was we convinced the Department of Energy that they should hold, it was 5 simultaneous regional workshops on the nuclear and what was necessary. And this was complicated because we had different regions of the country and we were trying to time sync them so they could all talk to each other. But out of that, we came up with a report that sort of led to gain. And it just gets me thinking about, more broadly, how do you deploy technology? And we started this series of discussions called the Nuclear Futures Discussions. And my only rule, so we pick a topic, economics or something like that, my only rule was maximum 20% of the people in the conversation could be nuclear engineers.
Oh.
Like I wanted to get other people to talk about how they viewed us, right? And it's also a way for us to broaden our reach and talk to other people. So we did that. And the second Nuclear Futures discussion, we held it at Taliesin in Wisconsin, which is Frank Lloyd Wright's design school. I wanted this atmosphere of we're sitting around the living room having a conversation about the future of the technology. Well, this is cool because it was actually his living room, right? But over time, I'm sort of drifting into this sense that it's not just the technical parts, and we need to figure out how to address that. Okay, so this is all percolating in my mind. I'm back at Wisconsin, and the University of Michigan says, hey, we'd like you to consider being the chair. Now, from a management standpoint, this is not a grand challenge. I mean, I've had 3 Navy commands. I've been the deputy at Idaho. But they said, this is the negotiation. I said, I will do that, but I want you to give me money that I can share with my faculty for them to start reaching out in an interdisciplinary way, right? And so I'm sort of motivated to start figuring out how to reconnect with campus. And if you'll allow me to sidetrack a second, this turned into like this wonderful story because as a grad student, I did not know. I went to Michigan as a grad student too. What I'm about to tell you, I did not know. But there's a history in the campus and just after World War II in something called the Michigan Memorial Phoenix Project, where the students petitioned the administration and said, we want you to do something as a tribute to fallen war vets. And they wanted it to be a living memorial, like no statue, no plaque, had to be living. And so they got together and after a couple of years of discussion decided the initiative would be to look at the civilian applications of atomic energy, right? Because at that point, it's all military. That's what people know. So the name comes from Michigan, it's the university. Memorial, it's a tribute to war vets. Phoenix, the mythical phoenix bird, which dies and reinvents itself. So the idea is we want people to think about nuclear differently. And it's the first fundraiser the university ever did. Right? You think universities raise funds all the time. So why in this case? Well, it was they wanted independence from the federal government. Because at that time, everything was military programs, classified. So I agreed to go to Michigan with this goal to broaden and start reconnecting with campus, right? Only to learn, like, that's the origin story of our department, right? And at a point in time, it was the conversation on campus. So I use this history to try to motivate our faculty and our students to think about broadening. And so that's my motivation. That's why I'm wanting to do this. And I'll modify your statement slightly in that we're not just hiring social scientists, we're hiring social scientists with nuclear credentials.
Okay.
Right? We're still a nuclear engineering department. Right? It's very hard for me to hire somebody who came directly out of, say, a sociology program.
Sure.
But it turns out there's a few sort of young scholars, right, who got their degrees in nuclear and then either through their thesis or through their postdoctoral work really started to look at social technical intersection or design choices through a sort of a social lens. And we managed to hire those in our department. And I'm clearly trying to make the rest of the country jealous, right, about the way you should do nuclear, because we're the number one ranked department in the country. And I want to use that as a platform to try to convince people we need to think more broadly than just technical. So it's a really long story, but we're doing a bunch of stuff. We call our research initiative the fastest path to zero, zero meaning zero carbon, but like think through the lens of technology, policy, social, when you're thinking about deploying technology. And I think it's good. And I think it helps us recruit better, because as I meet young people, they're way smarter at the things we're talking about than I was, right? Yeah. I went to school and it's technical and I just learned, math and Schrodinger's equation and all the stuff I'm supposed to do as an engineer. But they want to know what's the social component of deploying this. They want to know how entrepreneurship works. They want to know what policy levers are available. And so, I mean, if I approached it nothing more than just wanting to be the best recruiter in the campus, I still should be doing these things. So anyway, that's a long story about the motivation.
So just make sure I understand. Does everyone have like an initial technical background, or do you have any attorneys in the department? Or
we don't, right?
Okay.
So I'm differentiating. So with the tenure track faculty, they all have nuclear.
Okay.
Right? Some of the people in my research group do not.
Okay.
Right.
Gotcha.
Yeah. But that's easier, right?
Yeah.
Within your own research group, you can hire whoever you want.
Sure.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. We're kind of looking at the same thing. We don't have a nuclear engineering program here at the University of Wyoming, and it's, at least right now, it's cost prohibitive to start that up. But we're working with the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences to offer a nuclear energy science certificate. Right. That would be pretty technical. Our thought is that the follow-on for that actually would be a non-technical certificate. And looking at, the permitting side is huge. Also, the social sciences, reaching out to communities where such things would be cited. Wyoming has some real advantages in terms of public outreach, just because folks here, according to our polling, are very open to all kinds of energy. And we have longtime uranium production, largest in the nation. So they're also very open to nuclear energy. But we have to train and educate students and offer them credentials to look into that. So that's way in the future. You can't take the second certificate yet. We're just standing at the first one.
Well, but I think it's good, right? So, I came to it from a lens of I want to get nuclear engineers to be more appreciative of the social sciences. And this is everything from, normally if a nuclear engineer thinks about social, they'll think about the point where you cite it. Mm-hmm. But we're trying to get them to think about, start thinking about the social when you design it.
Right.
And think about it after you've cited it. So I try to find ways to motivate engineers. Like if I talk to you about an engineered system and I talk to you about the lifetime of your pump, as an engineer, you'd be like, I get it, right? I need to monitor the vibration and the lube oil pressure. But I want them to think about the data they can get, which is their relationship to the community, because that can change, right, over the course of running this, right? So it's sort of that appreciation. The other thing I was going to say is I still am involved in the NGO world somewhat. I'm the chair of a board of something called the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, but they struggle to find people in the policy world that have both of those skill sets, right? They can find a lot of people with the social part, but that just don't understand the nuclear part. And so I think your motivation is correct, right? The world needs people who are primarily engineers, but who can at least appreciate the social components of deploying technology, right? But they also need people who come from the social side that at least have some appreciation for the technology. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me.
Good.
I also think that if you look at nuclear, I'd say for decades, they ceded the social conversation to people outside the field.
Yeah.
And typically to people whose motivation was to more restrain the use, right? Rather than try to figure out how to optimize its use. And so I think we need people who are on the inside who are still willing to be sort of critical social look at it, right? But not coming from necessarily a starting point of wanting to constrain the technology.
And that's a good point. So in this conversation, just getting ready for this podcast, I was looking at your bio on the University of Michigan website, and I'm going to quote here. It says, you have authored over 200 technical publications, many of which are readable. That's funny. So that's not a common approach. How do you do that? How do you like cover the science of it and still make it readable?
So I think I was lucky. I didn't mention how I ended up at the think tank, but one of the nice things about doing that is they write in a very different way. So as an academic, there's a very standard way we write papers, right? And I get good at that, right? So I can get noticed by the technical community. But I think there's a certain art of storytelling that goes along with talking to people who are not deep in your field. Okay? And I used to get beat up like crazy when I first got to the think tank because they'd say, okay, I understand the point you're making, but you're not talking to PhDs in this case, right? And you need to figure out how to tell stories more simply. And so I think that partnership was just very useful because it makes you rethink your audience, not only in the way you write, but in the way you talk about it. And not jumping in too technical. Yeah. And I think this is actually good advice for young technical people too. I suggest to my students, when you go to a conference, pay attention to the people who are famous in their field and pay attention to the ones that can keep your attention the longest, even though you may not be exactly aligned with the technical thing they're doing. And those usually are the same people, right? The people who are famous in their field have figured out how to tell their story to broader audiences and keep you engaged in the importance of it, rather than the first slide is a set of equations which are incomprehensible to anyone but two people in the country, right? And you've seen those people talk too. Yeah. So I just recently wrote a piece as an example of something I probably wouldn't have thought about in a long time. But so the conversation, you've seen that?
Of course, yeah.
So they asked me, would I write a piece about what does it mean that Microsoft wants to restart the 3 Mile Island 1 plant? It's been shut down for about 5 years now. And what's involved in that? And from a technical side, it's, well, you need to make sure that you have fuel and you need to make sure that they have the license restored and you need to make sure and do engineering checks on all the components to make sure it all works well. But in a storytelling way, imagine you move to the city and you stop driving your car for 5 years. And then you decide you need to go on a trip. Well, what would you do? Well, you need to make sure there's gas in it. You'd have to make sure you had a driver's license. And then you'd have to check stuff. Is there lube? Is there oil in the car? Is there air in the tires? Right? That's really all they're doing. I mean, it's bigger and it's more checks, but fundamentally, that's what they're doing. Right? And so being able to talk about it that way, I think helps, right? Rather than diving into the differential pressure on the lube oil system.
I totally understand. I have to tell you, I'm also impressed with students today. I would have definitely considered everything we're talking about fluff.
Yeah.
And I was wrong. It doesn't go anywhere. Right. So just so you know, this certificate we're standing up does have as one of the classes that isn't required, but you can choose to take. It has an energy project, outreach, and communication class. Would you suggest that the folks who will take this, which will be technical students, would you suggest they should choose that one?
I think it's great. I mean, I think I would say yes. And even if they view that their core part of their life will be engineering, right? There is a possibility at some point that they become a manager or somebody with community interfacing responsibilities. But even if they don't do that, right, just to communicate well in your field right, and have people want to listen to you, it's just critical.
Yeah. So you mentioned when you came before you were at a town hall in Jackson, I was at that and heard you talk. And I remember one of the things that you said that I thought was very, very funny. And it was about safety. And nuclear energy, obviously, if you're in the field or familiar with the field, is a very, very safe industry. But what you said was, this is my paraphrasing, we're not going to win over hearts and minds by saying that nuclear energy causes less deaths than other energy sources.
Right.
So how are we going to win over hearts and minds?
So I think it's you, and this gets back to our having an appreciation for the social components of deploying technology, right? Like, why do people make choices, right? They make choices based on their own interests, their own value systems, and those can be very different depending on where you are in the country, right, or where you are in the world. And I think it's an odd thing. This is kind of how conversations like this are kind of how I also got to this sense that you need to think about social when you're thinking about deploying nuclear technology, because the nuclear community got convinced, right, that the reason that people didn't want nuclear were And it's a list. It's safety, waste, cost, right? And so they assume that addressing those through technical changes would then convince people. And I remember when I first joined Argonne, they were wrapping up a project called the Integral Fast Reactor, which actually a lot of that technology goes into natrium. So there's a history here. But in retrospect, as I listened to the solutions, they were all very technical, but they rarely address like, well, who actually wants this, right? And how is it different from other technology? And I think that's where we were failing, because we need to figure out, if I was going to have a conversation about energy. So I'm going to paraphrase a colleague of mine at the University of Michigan who does community facing studies. It's more solar and wind, but she tells her impressions of what works in the state of Michigan. And to understand that, you have to understand the local value system of the community. So her example is, you have a wind farm, and let's assume it's the exact same design, height, spacing, number. And you go to one part of the state that's primarily agricultural, right? And farming is known as a tough business. There are years where you're making money, there are years where you're not. So if you can go to a farmer and say, I will set up these windmills, you can still farm around them, you can still be a farmer, but it'll guarantee you a steady stream of income on which you can have your farm income. That is a compelling story, right? Because they like being farmers. If you go to a different part of the state, which is vacation cottages, right? Then they're going to look at this exact same thing through a very different lens, which is they bought that cottage to not be in the middle of a city or in the middle of industry. And you're fighting their local value system. And I think you need to understand that as a starting point before having this conversation, right? Some places may be perfectly happy with a reactor. First generation nuclear reactors, though, were all these gigantic machines, purposefully. Some of these advanced reactors are thinking about much smaller versions. The smaller versions may actually make sense in places that don't need a gigawatt, right? But you need to figure that out first. And our previous discussion about thinking about designing things with the consumer or with the public in mind, I mean, you should be thinking about that early. And how those design choices will determine how different people in the country will want or not want a product. And recognizing it's regional, right? If you're in the middle of Iowa and you've got great wind, they will take advantage of that. But if you go to a different part of the state that doesn't have that resource, their approach to this will be different.
I think that's really, really well said. We are absolutely struggling with some of the same issues here in Wyoming. And you mentioned these advanced reactors that often, pretty much all of them, are smaller than the big light water reactors that have been recently commissioned and have been around historically. So in the advanced reactor, microreactor space, what are you most excited about, and how do you see this unfolding? There's just a lot of action right now.
Yeah, so I will say that if you talk to engineers about advanced reactors, they will talk to you about the different fuel form and the different coolant, right? But I actually think, it's kind of interesting. Right? I actually think the more interesting thing to me is the fact that it's the business proposition behind it, right? You have got some companies who say, my reactor could be used directly to industry that just needs high temperature heat. So you can see in the papers, Dow has signed an MOU with one of these companies called X Energy, and Dow has said, if we as a company are going to decarbonize, what we need is steady state, sort of unwaverable temperature, right? I didn't realize this for a long time, but chemical engineering, they can't drift a lot off temperature without ruining the process. Right? But from their perspective, the idea of going from, say, solar to electricity and then electricity back to heat is very inefficient, right? They just want heat directly. So you have a company that says, although first generation nuclear may have been big electricity, other people may want something different. You have the microreactors who are thinking more remote, small usage, remote, not connected to the grid. But once you have that product, you can then think about things like military base that needs dedicated power. Like what happens if the grid goes down? What's their backup? And then the more that spreads, you could imagine there may be some community that wants to be more independent of the grid. So in Ann Arbor, where the University of Michigan is, they're talking very publicly, they would like to break free of their utility. Right? They're not talking about nuclear, but they want to essentially be their own little microgrid. Right? Well, you could imagine if a micro-sized reactor existed, there could be communities in the country that for them that would be okay. That would be a good solution. Because you're always trading off with the renewables, it's land use, you just need more space in order to take advantage of them. And there may be cases where that doesn't align with the local aspirations or the local values, and a reactor might. So it's a long way of saying, to me, it's the business case, the different thinking about how you could use reactors, and sort of gets back to the whole fastest path to zero thinking, right, is don't start with the technology, start with what does the community want?
Yeah.
And then design to that.
Well, we also have, you're in the least populated state in the country. We have some very remote communities. So I don't know how wind and solar could address the reliability. Really, that would be challenging in some of these communities. But nuclear could actually increase the amount of time that they have electricity, right? They're end of the line. You're a small community. You're going to be last to be served if there's some kind of like storm or something, power lines go down. So in addition, we also, our core industries can be in very remote locations.
Yeah.
Maybe you don't need something like a power plant that's going to be there for 30 years. You need something that's going to provide heat, maybe electricity for a short amount of time. That's where this becomes extremely compelling. And again, it's 24/7
right.
for even, years.
Yeah.
So
to go back to the beginning of our discussion, submarines do not come back from sea because we're running out of fuel.
Yeah.
We come back because we ran out of food. Or because the people can't stand each other after about 10 weeks, right?
10 weeks. Okay. Yeah. Definitely. Yeah. Reactor fuel can last longer than that. So what do you think here in Wyoming, the School of Energy Resources and the University of Wyoming, and maybe academia across the country in general, what should we be doing? What should we be focused on to be a part and serve this advancing industry?
Yeah, so I think you have one advantage in that you as a state have collaborated with one of the first movers in this space, right? So you have a visibility that others don't. I assume that helps when you go talk to the state legislature about building out programs that have a nuclear component.
Sure.
I saw the same thing at the federal level. I go back to this story of GAIN I talked about before. Once Congress saw, my version, once Congress saw that there were real companies and real money, it wasn't just a research project, the support for nuclear at the federal level has been bipartisan, bicameral for a decade. It's amazing, right? So there's a certain realness to it. And I think, so from that though, you sit in a leadership position in answering some of the questions we've talked about, right? Because for the advanced nuclear industry to do well, those projects need to do well, right? If they come away from that with the state or the folks in Kemmer saying, this was a great decision on our part, like other mayors, other state governments will notice. On the other hand, if they come away from that saying like, we made a big mistake in going down that pathway, people will notice, right? And so I think you have the advantage, I'll say advantage, like people are paying a lot of attention, but it also gives you the opportunity to be thoughtful in a lot of the things that we've talked about relative to getting not only the technology right, but the relationship with the community and the long-term success of the project. So, and then I think if it works, right, there are opportunities, I think, to think about expanding in workforce and training because people will look here, right? This is where it gets done. And it's not just, I just mentioned that project, but I also know that Mike Wandler up at LMH is talking about nuclear in different ways, and like BWXT has this study to look at using microreactors in a mine, right? So in many ways, you're like at the forefront of this conversation nationally, and I think it just gives you the opportunity to become leaders in a way that we can't. Like we at the University of Michigan would love to help you, but we can't show up in a town in Wyoming and go, hey, we're from Michigan. You should pay a lot of attention. We're here to help. Well, yeah, they'll be like, well, buy a burger then, right?
Yeah. Totally. But you are absolutely helping. We really appreciate you being here today to talk to folks. And you also serve on the advisory board for our Nuclear Energy Research Center. So appreciate that and appreciate all the help. And I do think you've made a good point. Wyoming seems very dedicated to really leveraging first mover projects here. So you already mentioned some of the work going on with the Natrium facility. There are Wyoming contractors that are working on that now, and hopefully will continue to do so. So they've recently broken ground, and they're working on construction with the BWXT. The Wyoming Energy Authority has actually funded a study to look at what could be manufactured here in the state for some of these microreactors. So we're looking at where do we fit in? And of course, we have the uranium. We have the power plant going in. What else can we leverage to be part of this growing industry? And so that's all work happening across the state. But I also would just say, probably don't send a bunch of nuclear engineers to say, we're from Michigan, we're here to help. What do you want to know? But you personally engaging with us has been incredibly helpful, and really appreciate you doing that.
Yeah, glad to. I think the other thing is that my sense is that Wyoming, because it's an energy state, is sort of pragmatic about this, right? In a way that California can't be. Like, California is thinking about continuing the life of a nuclear plant that they plan to shut down, but just because of where they think the ultimate limitation of losing that plant, right? It's super hard if you're going to power the entire state on wind solar batteries.
Right.
I fundamentally don't think there's a perfect energy source, and in the end we end up using a mix of these. So I think you all have a certain pragmatism that is useful, because other states would have to fail first and then come back, whereas you seem to be like, let's just do it.
Yeah, but think about what does failure in Wyoming look like? It's really cold, and all of a sudden you don't have reliable energy. That is an unacceptable outcome. Yeah. So maybe not as scary in California.
Yeah, could be.
So you spend a lot of your time, obviously, teaching and educating and training the next generation of nuclear energy scientists. What advice would you have for young people if they're interested in nuclear energy and considering going into that field?
So I think the advice would be the same whether it was nuclear or anything else. And I think if I look back on my career, this is the way it worked out. Like, I don't think you can plan your life.
Oh, right.
Like
definitely.
This concept that I know, and I can put myself on a trajectory for the next 20, 30 years. I mean, you could.
You could try.
Being really boring. But I think it's like what you should do is you should do things that are interesting and excite you, that by doing them, you can see a clear path to being smarter or having different skills than you had before, right? And if you do that, you will reach a juncture and somebody will notice you. And they will say, hey, I noticed you're doing really good things. Would you like to go do
really good things over here?
Over here. Yeah. And at that point, you get this choice, right? Because if you love the thing you're doing, you keep doing it. If not, you do something else. Like I skipped a ton of details in the biography part, but I mean, I kind of ended up being the deputy lab director at Idaho because when they came and asked me as a Wisconsin faculty if I would help them turn the advanced test reactor into a national user facility, something that people from around the country can write proposals for, I did. And then there's a sequence of events where I'm becoming more and more visible within the lab, even though I'm just a professor who's getting half their time paid for, right? But they sort of noticed me, right? And if I hadn't taken that opportunity, then I never would have been offered the position. And there was a certain point where I could say, no, I just want to go back and be a faculty member. Or I could say, no, I want to try and be the deputy lab director for a while. And because I decided to be the deputy lab director, I meet the think tank people. And then when the deputy lab director job ends, I have this choice. Do I want to go straight back to academia? Do I want to do something else? I'm going to go in DC and be part of a think tank. I have no training in being a think tank, right? But we actually won a best national paper for think tank stuff, right? Like, there's no part of my career that says I should be able to do that. But take a chance on yourself. Sure.
Yeah. That's very well said. I also have had a lot of the same experiences, and it's funny. It happens when you don't think, and you're not thinking about it. You're just doing something and you're following what's interesting, and all of a sudden you're at this juncture that you didn't know was coming. So that's definitely been my experience too. So really appreciate the great advice. So for our last few questions, these aren't going to be related to nuclear energy.
Yep.
You have an interesting kind of side, I don't know if hobby is the right word, passion project. 2016 was your best summer ever, as you've described it. What did you do?
So I really like baseball, and I like going to different baseball stadiums. And so I'm I spend a lot of energy to do this, right? So nice thing about being an academic is you go to conferences, you go to different places in the world. And so given the opportunity, I'll go to games. And so twice, the first was in 2000, I got to spend a year in Washington, D.C., working with the Department of Energy. When you're on the East Coast, there are a lot of major league, minor league teams in close proximity. So from D.C., you can plan a 3-day weekend, right? If I leave work at 2 o'clock on Friday, I can get to Stadium A. I'll see a game, and then I can drive to the next town for Saturday night. There's usually a Sunday afternoon game. You get 3 in the weekend, and you go back. So that first one, I got to 42 different stadiums.
Wow.
Then when I went back and spent the summer of 2016 working with the think tank, working with Third Way, I said I should try to do better. I got to 64.
Wow.
Which it takes a lot of planning because, and especially if you have like a rain delay or something, it ruins three games, right?
Yeah.
And then there's a lot of where am I going to be professionally, and what's my radius of travel that I'm willing to go to. So when I was in the Navy Reserve, there was one period of time where I was having to fly to Atlanta, right? But now I'm saying, okay, well, if I drive just 2 hours, I can get to this game over in Georgia, right? Anyway, but if you think about 64, that's baseball season's about 6 months long. So you're like 11. That's like 3 a week.
It's pretty good.
So there's a massive pre-planning and then a lot of luck.
I remember you talking about how being in the Navy really helped you to be very detail oriented. And I think it's benefited you in your career, and also going to see 64 baseball teams in 2016 or stadiums, baseball stadiums. Stadiums. Got it. Okay. Incredible. Okay. So last question. You've been to Wyoming a number of occasions. Is there anywhere in particular that you really like to visit?
So I'd say a few things. So, I mean, I lived in Idaho Falls for a long time. And so going over to Jackson and Tetons, it's just gorgeous. It's a little bit touristy, but it's so pretty. I was blown away by L&H Industries when I went and visited Gillette. Like, I'm always blown away by big engineering. Same thing when I visited Dow. Like we teach students engineering, but we really teach them the theory of engineering. Yeah. Sometimes you don't get a perspective on the size and scope of things that we do. So I think those will always sort of be good memories. And then I have a place that's fond in my heart, and you'll laugh at me, right? Because I'm one of many people who don't come from Wyoming who've done the same thing. And I'm going to say that it's because Rawlins felt so welcoming to me. But the reason it was so welcoming, this is 1985, and I'm in the Navy, and I'm having to get over to Seattle, and the Navy says you have to here by X date. So my wife and I are trying to drive there in December. Yep. And we get into western Wyoming, and the snow's blowing, and our goal was to get to Rawlins. And I'm thinking we should probably stop in Cheyenne, Laramie. But somehow we go over a mountain, and then it's fine. And I convinced myself the snow is only on the eastern side, and off we go. And I swear we almost died. Okay. Right? I mean, it was just so bad, right? And we were just like behind a semi and just letting him plow. And so I just have this fond thing because like Rawlins is the place where I did not die, right?
Yeah. So did you get off the road in Rawlins?
Yeah.
Okay, good for you.
That was our original goal. And then of course by the time it was there, like there was no way I was driving any further at that point. Yeah.
Great.
So I have a soft spot in my heart.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you so much for all you do. Thank you for helping us with our Nuclear Energy Research Center, for joining us here at the School of Energy Resources, and for doing this podcast.
Yeah, glad to. Yeah, anytime.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.